The film is set in the late 19th century in a small town called Sweetwater. On that day, the town's atmosphere seemed calm and peaceful. Some residents were seen moving about around the main bank located in the center of the small town. However, no one realized that dozens of watchful eyes were lurking from within the crowd with revolvers and rifles ready to be fired. They are the Blackjack Britain Gang, a criminal group that often loots small towns in the Wild West region. Led by a man known for his cruelty, Jack Smith, or commonly called Blackjack, this group always targets the main banks in any town they visit for their robberies. And it is recorded that they rarely fail in executing their every action. However, this time there is something slightly bothering Blackjack's mind, because his right-hand man, Kevin, is bringing along his young nephew named Sonny to participate in the robbery plan. Blackjack's anxiety about Sonny's participation this time can be said to be reasonable, considering the young man's naivety and innocent demeanor. Moreover, this is his first time participating in a robbery. It should be known that Sonny is just a village farmer's son who has never once pointed a gun's muzzle at anyone. His daily life is very monotonous. He is a bookworm who spends his time reading fiction novels and historical stories about the prowess of legendary shooters from the past. After all preparations were deemed sufficient, Blackjack along with Kevin and two other members entered the bank, and the robbery began.
Everybody, grab a ceiling. Kill. Open the safe. Open the safe.
For a few moments, everything seemed under control. However, Sonny, who was supposed to remain vigilant, instead struck up a conversation with a famous actress or novelist who happened to be passing by the location. Just as Sonny asked his idol to sign one of his favorite novels, several security patrol soldiers arrived at the location. Although aware that great danger was approaching, Sonny, who was entering the world of crime for the first time, truly did not know what to do. In his confusion, suddenly a gunshot was heard from inside the bank, along with the fall of a deputy. The situation, which was initially under control, turned into chaos and panic. Deafening gunshots one after another became unavoidable. Casualties fell, not only from the two sides exchanging fire, but also several civilians became victims. After ensuring the leader and his comrades escaped with the looted money, all members of the Blackjack Britain Gang simultaneously spurred their horses away from the robbery site, leaving behind several comrades who died from hot lead. Unfortunately, Sonny was the only one left behind. He tried to save Beer, who had been shot in the stomach. Luckily, in that rescue attempt they managed to escape and catch up with the group at the rendezvous point. At that time, Blackjack could be sure that the sheriff and his deputies would soon pursue them to seize the money they had looted. Therefore, with the remaining number of members, they loaded the bags of money onto the pack horse. Blackjack then decided to immediately continue the journey to Mexico, a town considered safe enough to divide the loot. They kept spurring their horses through the scorching desert to escape the sheriff's pursuit. However, the journey was not easy for Blackjack and his gang, considering the horses were starting to tire and several members were injured. Meanwhile, the sheriff and his deputies rode their horses in prime condition, even with more people. Seeing Beer's condition worsening, Sonny, who felt pity, asked them to stop the journey for a while so Beer could rest.
It's your brother.
Think I give a damn? Well, why don't we make camp so we can have a nice long nap?
Instead of delaying the journey due to Beer's severe injury, Blackjack set aside his sympathy. He realized that if they stopped, the worst risk was they would all end up on the gallows if caught. There was no other choice but to spur the horses as hard as possible again, even when night fell. That was not a reason to stop before they arrived in Mexico. Dehydration made some members with minor wounds feel as if they no longer felt pain, as the bloodstains on their clothes dried. However, not for Beer, who had a gunshot wound in the abdomen. He grimaced in pain but pretended nothing was wrong. Luckily, Sonny still cared, accompanying and strengthening him. Nevertheless, Beer still could not hold on. Eventually, he collapsed and fell from his horse.
Until what? Until that posse rides up? I can't spare the bullet.
Blackjack, who left without caring about Beer's fate, forced Sonny to comply with Beer's request, even though it went against his conscience. However, Seeing Beer's suffering, he immediately pulled the trigger of his pistol straight to Beer's heart. And without Sony realizing, this was the first time he had pulled the trigger of his weapon and taken a life. Sony, still immersed in sadness over Beer's death, did not notice the arrival of the sheriff and his deputies. Without warning, they fired shots until a bullet lodged in Sony's leg. Even though outnumbered and the chance of surviving the sheriff and his men's pursuit grew smaller, it didn't mean the Blackjack Britain gang chose to surrender just like that. Eventually, they managed to save themselves. However, a lucky shot from the sheriff hit the pack horse carrying the leather bags containing the loot. As a result, this time the Blackjack Britain gang had to relinquish their loot to be reclaimed. They continued their journey home empty-handed, accepting the reality that this was one risk that might be better than ending up dead foolishly. After a long time feeling the slap of sand in their faces from a storm that seemed to mock their failure, Blackjack and his friends arrived at a rocky cliff pass. When they were right at the edge of the cliff, it was then they realized the horses had taken them away from the way home. So, it could be confirmed that the place where they were now was not Mexico, the final destination they had planned earlier. Instead, what appeared before them now was a green valley filled with trees and rivers. Seeing the condition of his members who were exhausted after the long journey and the place they aimed for was still very far, Blackjack decided to enter the valley with his members hoping to find a settlement. And sure enough, not long after they spurred their horses, they found a footpath. There, a very strange old Indian was seen sitting silently in front of a dilapidated, unfenced gate. Although this seemed odd, what caught their attention more was a small town beginning to appear in front of them. Slowly and cautiously, they continued into the small town, passing people who kept staring at them with sharp, questioning looks. Finally, a sheriff greeted them along with a deputy.
Welcome to Refuge, strangers.
Thank you, Sheriff. Problem is, we wasn't due to get paid till we delivered the herd to Sweetwater. We was moving a herd up from Chihuahua when Patches attacked us.
Welcome, strangers. I assume you're the herders moving from Chihuahua when the Apaches attacked. Seeming to readily believe Blackjack's words that they were a group of cattle drivers who had been victims of robbery by a tribe of Indians, without showing the slightest doubt or suspicion, the charismatic-looking sheriff invited them to rest their horses. The sheriff also offered lodging, provided treatment for the wounded, and even kindly offered drinks at the bar, all given for free without having to pay a single cent. The sheriff also said that the small town was a bustling settlement, so they could stay as long as they wanted. However, with one condition, they must not utter curses or harsh words while in the town. That offer was certainly not wasted by the Blackjack Britain gang. After finishing the conversation, some of them immediately rushed to the nearest well. Meanwhile, Blackjack, Kevin, and the others entered the bar, while Sony and several wounded members followed a girl named Rose to a doctor's house for treatment.
You thinking what I'm thinking?
Yeah, you notice he wasn't packing.
Step inside, gentlemen. All right, you're next, son.
Although they were quite impressed by the sheriff and townspeople's hospitality, the evil nature within Blackjack and his men remained unchanged. In Blackjack's mind, a malicious intent surfaced, supported by Kevin, except for the innocent and untempted Sony. Besides being amazed by the hospitality he received, especially when seeing the face of the doctor treating him, Sony felt as if he knew the people in that place. His innocence made him the only foreign guest who could blend well with the residents, especially with Rose, the beautiful village belle. Rose's kindness even made Sony start to have feelings for her. After all the foreign guests were lulled by the hospitality they received, unknown to Blackjack, Kevin, and Sony, the sheriff along with several other residents secretly began identifying the bullets extracted from the bodies of those wolves in sheep's clothing. They easily recognized that the bullets were not from an Indian tribe. This directly proved that Blackjack's story claiming they were herders victimized by a group of Indians was nothing but a lie.
Got about as much chance of that as a one-legged man at a...
Getting out of this jackpot, I'm pinning it on Forrest.
And maybe they'll drop us a little thank you note on the way out of town.
In the afternoon, the loud sound of a church bell suddenly rang, making everyone rush into the church, including the bartender serving Blackjack and his friends at the bar. Seeing this situation, Blackjack and Kevin felt happy, increasingly confident that their evil plan would proceed easily.
It's none of your damn business.
That night, while Sony tried to get closer to Rose by showing his books, Kevin, who was drunk, approached them. In his drunken state, Kevin almost acted out of line towards Rose, heating the situation and triggering a reaction from the sheriff. Worried the situation would worsen, Sony dared to hit his uncle's head, causing Kevin to fall unconscious. At that moment, Sony questioned why the sheriff remained so calm, not even showing any intention to draw his pistol even though Kevin had aimed a weapon at him. Without giving an answer, the sheriff chose to remain silent. He even left Sony, who was starting to look confused.
Y'all go to bed.
What the hell happened?
I didn't see. I think,
More likely somebody fell him.
The next day, while Sony was fetching water, the sheriff approached and greeted him while giving advice about life choices. From the sheriff's words, his sympathy for Sony was revealed, whom he considered a good young man who should not be entangled with the barbaric group he now followed. Sony was stunned for a moment, impressed by the sheriff's keen judgment. A moment later, Sony accidentally noticed something from the sheriff's posture and appearance. His figure strongly resembled a legendary fast shooter whom the world believed had died 10 years ago, known as Wild Bill Hickok. Sketches of his face were often seen by Sony in the historical notebooks he always carried. That afternoon, on Blackjack's orders, Kevin took Sony with him to get ammunition from a supply store in one corner of the small town, of course, in an illegal way. Meanwhile, the despicable Uncle Kevin slowly took boxes of ammunition and slipped them under his jacket, while Sony was assigned as a distraction when dealing with the shop owner. Once again, Sony felt that the face was familiar in his memory, reminding him of another legendary figure named Jesse James, known as the most wanted and feared fugitive for his prowess in the criminal world before being reported dead several years ago. However, before Sony could confirm what he saw, Kevin, who had gotten what he was looking for, immediately took him away from the store.
thank you, sir.
Kevin's bad actions turned out to be known by the shop owner, who immediately reported it to the sheriff. Meanwhile, Blackjack, tired of being polite, felt no need to disguise their identity as street wolves any longer. He ordered his men to make a commotion shamelessly. All members of the Blackjack Britain gang spurred their horses back and forth at high speed in the streets of the small town, disturbing the residents with the dust and noise caused. Even some of the bandits started playing knife-throwing at objects hung on the church door. Witnessing their insolent actions, the sheriff tried to give a warning in a still polite manner. However, it was ignored. Even when the sheriff blocked his body in front of the church door to stop them from throwing knives at the holy building, the bandits arrogantly continued their wicked action, making the sheriff the target of their knife throws. Whether by coincidence or an omen, black clouds suddenly appeared, turning the once bright day dark. This natural phenomenon stunned all the townspeople, but not the Blackjack Britain gang, who grew more uncontrollable. Finally, when a knife almost flew towards the sheriff's vital spot, a sudden lightning strike charred the knife thrower's body, followed by falling raindrops and the loud echo of the bell suddenly ringing by itself. That tragic and strange incident seemed like a strong enough warning to stop Blackjack and his men's wild behavior. The atmosphere calmed again until evening approached. However, Sony, still curious and harboring feelings for Rose, sneaked out again to steal a chance to meet and exchange words with the girl who was currently gathered with the sheriff and other hosts inside the church. When the awaited time arrived, a horse-drawn carriage suddenly appeared and stopped right in front of the church, letting off a woman he knew very well. The actress idol from the dime novel who had previously died in his arms during the shootout in Sweetwater before they all arrived in this small town. Not wanting to be trapped in confusion, Sony tried to chase the carriage that started moving after everyone went back into the church. However, strangeness occurred again. His eyes no longer captured the form of the mysterious carriage, although the rumble of wheels and the sound of horses' hooves were still heard around him. The next day, Sony approached the sheriff who was guiding the new female arrival along with the doctor and Rose. Without beating around the bush, Sony expressed his curiosity and suspicion about the oddities he witnessed the night before. However, although Sony insisted with his belief, not one of them gave a satisfactory answer. The woman even evaded, claiming she was not the same person Sony had met before. Unsatisfied with the answers he heard, Sony was determined to prove his suspicion in his own way. He secretly tailed the doctor, who immediately showed a quick reaction, revealing that his true identity was Doc Holliday, a deadly revolver user in his time. His fame might be equal to Sheriff Wild Bill Hickok, the legendary fast shooter. Even the deputy sheriff seemed to represent Billy the Kid, a young criminal who had killed as many as his age before being reported dead at 21. To further confirm his conclusion that this small town was filled with legendary former criminals undergoing repentance, Sony then approached a farmer named Lem whom he believed was another legendary figure, Lance Henriksen. However, before Lem could validate the truth of Sony's guess, two Blackjack Britain gang members suddenly appeared, causing chaos in the farmland. This situation made Lem alias Henriksen lose control of his patients, resulting in the death of one of the Blackjack members.
Tersebut.
Whatever happened to the actual mysterious old Indian man? But clearly, after finishing off one of Blackjack's men, Lem looked very regretful and filled with fear. Rose and the other residents could only watch with pitying looks as the mysterious man took the unfortunate Lem through the old unfenced gate, then disappeared behind a smoke haze and never returned. Meanwhile, at almost the same time, the sheriff was seen struggling to suppress his anger. His patience was almost gone seeing Blackjack and his gang act more wildly. In a firm but calm tone, the sheriff asked Blackjack to leave the town immediately. However, instead of obeying the order, the wannabe tough guy Blackjack attacked the sheriff right then.
Glenn, no!
Not satisfied with that attack, Blackjack immediately took out his old revolver and pointed the weapon right at the sheriff's face. However, when he was about to pull the trigger, sudden doubt haunted him, accompanied by a strong earthquake shaking the ground they stood on, and the sound of the church bell echoing in the distance.
What the hell is that?
For some reason, Sony, who had just arrived, was not allowed into the bar by Kevin. Feeling curious, he peeked inside and was shocked when he heard the evil plan of Blackjack and Kevin. They intended to loot the small town. And more terrifyingly, Blackjack and Kevin had ordered all their men to kill anyone trying to thwart that plan. Without wasting time, Sony immediately rushed to find Rose, the girl he loved, to warn her about Blackjack and Kevin's evil plan. Upon arriving, Sony almost forgot his initial intention when he saw a circular scar on Rose's neck, something he had previously missed. Instantly, Sony remembered the woman who had died in his embrace some time ago. There was a disturbing strangeness, and the resemblance of the sheriff and several other residents to legendary figures from the past. Sony became increasingly convinced that everyone in this remote town were those who had died and were given a chance to live again to atone for their sins from their previous lives. Finally, Rose also admitted the truth Sony believed. When Sony remembered his purpose again, he immediately warned Rose that Blackjack and his gang were planning a major crime that could endanger her and all the townspeople. However, instead of worrying, Rose told Sony to immediately save himself. Not wanting to leave the people he considered good, Sony begged Rose to give him a chance to convince the sheriff and townspeople to fight back.
They're gonna tear up the town. I heard him say it.
But you're gonna have to ride out with them when they leave tomorrow.
After being persuaded, Rose finally agreed. And at her request, the sheriff and townspeople allowed Sony into the church that night to express his concerns. Unfortunately, Sony's efforts to convince the townspeople only met a dead end. Not because they were afraid or lacked weapons, but because those residents were only given a 10-year time limit to repent until God's messenger came to fetch them back. During that time, they were forbidden from repeating the mistakes they made in the past. If they violated, they would face another of God's messengers in the form of an old Indian guardian of the punishment gate. Thus, it was revealed that what happened to Lem earlier was the consequence he had to accept for breaking the agreement.
After what happened to Brother Lamb, I ain't about.
Well, then at least stand up to him and take a few of them down with you.
We go up against the Britain gang armed, we're doomed.
For 10 years, neither inflicting nor attracting harm.
You'd think some of you used to be my hero.
Rose, unable to bear hearing what Blackjack and Kevin had done to Sony, immediately approached, followed by everyone. However, there wasn't much they could do considering the risk they had to bear if involved and provoked into repeating past mistakes, namely spilling blood. Luckily, Sony could hold on, although he fainted before Blackjack and Kevin left him. After that, Rose along with the sheriff took him to the doctor's house, and on the doctor's instruction, Sony regained consciousness.
Yes, Sonny.
It's too bad.
At that time, the sheriff apologized because he could only express his concern without being able to do much about what Sony experienced. In short, morning arrived. Blackjack and his men were seen packing up, arranging their horse saddles, preparing to execute their evil plan. On the other hand, Rose was seen running to the sheriff with an anxious face after finding Sony was no longer in his bed. Rose worried Sony would really do what he said last night, which was to face Blackjack and Kevin alone. And sure enough, not long after, Sony appeared from behind the wall of a resident's house with staggering steps. He walked towards Blackjack and his gang. Although his body was injured and looked weak, not a bit of hesitation was seen in his eyes. At the same time, the church bell rang loudly again. That was a sign that all residents must immediately enter the church. Although there wasn't much time left before entering the church, the sheriff and deputy kept trying to convince Sony to change his decision. However, Sony did not back down. Presumably, Sony's determination made the sheriff hesitate to enter the church. How he felt he had been selfish and self-centered. While in front of him a foreign young man with a pure heart chose to stand his ground and sacrifice himself for others. The sheriff went back into his office and took out his pair of old revolvers, ready to become Wild Bill Hickok, the legendary fast shooter, again. So did the deputy, Billy the Kid, and also the shopkeeper alias Jesse James, deciding to join in preparation. Once again, the sheriff offered Blackjack and his gang a chance to leave the town without bloodshed. At that moment, Blackjack briefly saw the figure of the legendary Wild Bill Hickok in the sheriff's appearance now armed. However, Kevin denied it because they knew the legendary fast shooter had died 10 years ago. They continued preparing to proceed with the looting. When Kevin tried to draw his pistol to start shooting, a quick reaction from the sheriff stunned them.
I have no mother.
Although a bit late, finally Blackjack and Kevin realized who stood before them. However, feeling superior in numbers, Blackjack remained arrogant and cocky. When two of his men who had sneaked almost stole the opportunity, the doctor alias Doc Holliday suddenly appeared with a rifle blast that immediately took down both of them.
The odds are getting better.
One by one, members of the Blackjack Britain gang fell from their horses, accompanied by the frightened whinnies of horses. Although outnumbered, it didn't take long for the sheriff and the other residents to take down more than half of Blackjack's men. Realizing victory was not on their side, Blackjack and Kevin spurred their horses away from the shootout arena after giving a hot bullet that lodged in Sony's shoulder. Not long after, all members of the Blackjack Britain gang were finally brought down. Miraculously, not a single scratch was on the sheriff and others' bodies, except for Sony who had a minor wound on his shoulder. However, unfortunately, Rose, thinking the situation was already safely under control, joyfully ran to Sony and hugged him. Unexpectedly, Kevin reappeared from another direction and immediately fired shots at them. After Kevin lay dead, a miracle occurred. Sony, who was shot in a vital spot, not only didn't die, but also didn't feel any pain at all. The sheriff then approached Sony, patted his shoulder while congratulating him, considering that Sony had now officially become part of the town's permanent residence. As the sheriff unbuckled his revolver belt, everyone thought the situation was under control. However, their guess was wrong because Blackjack reappeared with all his arrogance. With a shout of annoyance, he challenged the sheriff to a gun duel. But before his revolver could aim properly, a quick movement from the sheriff made Blackjack kneel with a hole in his left chest.
Wild Bill Hickok. I reckon the odds are against me now. Put that gun belt back on. We got one thing left to settle. That's you and me. Look at Blackjack Britton.
And so ended the story of the Blackjack Britton gang, along with the return of peace to the town. The mysterious old Indian reappeared, carrying the bandits' bodies one by one and taking them behind the unfenced gate, throwing them into the abyss of eternal misery. Behind the happiness after successfully restoring peace to the small town, the sheriff, deputy, doctor, and shopkeeper still had to be held accountable for all their actions that violated the applicable law. Because however you look at it, rules are still rules. Just as everyone was trying to hold back their sadness before their departure to the punishment zone, a horse-drawn carriage bringing good news suddenly arrived. The carriage brought the joyful news that the actions of the four were deemed worthy of an exception by the Almighty. They were declared to have passed the test of patience and were allowed to return to his side with full forgiveness. At that very moment, because he had stayed on the side of goodness even though he once walked with the servants of evil, Sony was allowed to board the carriage. However, he chose to stay to accompany his beloved woman until the time of his calling arrived. The sheriff then handed over his law enforcement badge as a sign of trust in Sony's steadfastness, before then entering the carriage and departing with the others towards heaven. And the film ends.